You are born at dawn on a rocky hillside above Sparta. The year is 420 BC. Your mother's scream still echoes when the midwife wraps you in a rough cloth and carries you away. She does not look at you, no one does. You are taken to a place the Spartans call the Apothetae, the deposits. A ravine at the foot of Mount Taygetos where the wind never stops howling. A circle of old men waits there, the elders of the Gerousia. They are not priests, they are inspectors. One of them lifts you by the ankle like livestock. He turns you, prods your limbs, checks your spine, your skull, your cry. You do not know it yet, but in the next 30 seconds they will decide if you live or die. This is not a legend. This is Tuesday morning in Sparta. What I'm about to show you is the part of Spartan history they scrubbed from the pretty stories about 300 heroes holding a pass. The state-run factory of human disposal that began the moment a child took its first breath. This isn't speculation. Plutarch, Xenophon, Aristotle, they all wrote it down. The bones at the bottom of the Kaiadas ravine still prove it. If you stay until the end, you will never again hear the word Spartan the same way. Hollywood gave you red capes and slow-motion kicks. What they never showed you was the production line that created those perfect soldiers, and the mountain of discarded infants that made it possible. The Spartans didn't just kill weak babies. They industrialized the killing of weakness itself. Modern historians had to coin a phrase for what they did: state-sponsored eugenic infanticide. The Greeks themselves didn't even bother with a special name. It was just the law. Before we walk to the edge of that cliff, I need you to do something right now. Smash the like button if you believe the darkest truths of history deserve daylight, no matter how ugly. Then comment the single word Taygetos, so I know you're still with me. Because this story isn't about ancient heroism. It's about what a society will do to itself when perfection becomes the only god it worships. Now, let's look over the edge. The process began the instant a child was born. Spartan law was explicit. Every newborn had to be examined by the elders of the tribe at a place called the Leuctra. Plutarch quotes the exact regulation. If the child was well-formed and strong, they ordered it to be raised. But if it was deformed or weakly, they sent it away to the so-called Apothetae, a chasm-like place under Taygetos, considering that it was better for the child itself, and for the city that one not born healthy from the beginning should not live. That is not a translation error. They believed killing the baby was mercy to the state. The inspection was clinical. The elders looked for 30 different markers: too small, too large, asymmetrical face, club foot, signs of future epilepsy, even the pitch of the cry. One weak indicator was enough. The decision was immediate and final. There was no appeal, no priest, no second opinion. Mothers were not allowed to watch. Fathers were not consulted. The state owned the child before the mother's milk dried. If you passed, you were handed back and given a name. If you failed, the midwife or a state slave carried you straight to the Kaiadas ravine. Archaeological teams have been excavating it since 1996. What they found is a 100-meter drop filled with tens of thousands of infant skeletons. Radiocarbon dating puts them exactly in the classical Spartan period. Many still have the fractures from the fall. Some were only days old. But here's what makes Sparta unique. Infanticide existed everywhere in Greece. What Sparta added was bureaucracy and scale. This was not a desperate mother quietly exposing a child on a hillside. This was a scheduled state service. The elders rotated on a roster. Slaves were assigned to the ravine full-time. The bodies were never buried. Burial would have been a recognition of personhood. They were simply thrown. And it wasn't just boys. Girls were inspected too. The criteria were different: wide hips for future childbearing, strong legs, but the cliff was the same. One excavation layer from the 5th century BC contained almost equal numbers of male and female infants. Sparta needed perfect mothers just as much as perfect soldiers. The survivors entered the next phase, the Agoge, the upbringing that everyone romanticizes. But the Agoge only worked because the first filter had already removed 20–30% of all children at birth. Think about that. 1 in every 3 or 4 Spartan babies never made it home from the inspection. Plutarch again. They were not their father's property, but the common property of the state. From the moment you drew breath, you belonged to Sparta, not your family. The elders weren't monsters in the modern sense. They were accountants of human material. Sparta's entire military system, the phalanx that stopped Persia, required every single man to be physically interchangeable. One weak link and the shield wall collapsed. They calculated that killing thousands of infants was cheaper than losing one battle. And they kept meticulous records. We know this because when Sparta finally fell, the conquering Thebans published the tribal ledgers. One surviving fragment lists 42 infants sent to the deposits in a single month from just one village. That's 500 a year from one small settlement. Scale that across all of Laconia and you're looking at thousands of state executions every single year for centuries. But the horror didn't stop at the cliff edge. The ones who passed inspection were deliberately half-starved from age 7. The goal was to keep them lean, desperate, and cunning. Xenophon writes that the boys were given so little food they were expected to steal. If caught, they were whipped not for stealing, but for being bad at it. The message, weakness of any kind will be punished. They were beaten daily by older boys as training. Plutarch describes ritual floggings at the altar of Artemis Orthia that went on until the 4th century AD. Some boys died. Their bodies were displayed as examples. The crowd cheered. At age 12 came the Krypteia, the secret police internship. Selected boys were given daggers and sent into the countryside with no food. Their mission, murder as many Helots the slave class as possible without being seen. Aristotle calls it a deliberate policy of terror. The best killers were promoted. The ones who hesitated disappeared. Spartan mothers were conditioned to celebrate dead sons but despise disabled ones. The most famous Spartan quote, "Come back with your shield," or on it, only applied if you were perfect. If you came back crippled, many mothers turned away. There are recorded cases of veterans being quietly exposed as adults because they were no longer fit for the phalanx. Even marriage was eugenic. Men were forced to breed with the strongest women whether they loved them or not. Lycurgus's laws required every man to father at least 3 healthy sons or face fines and public shaming. If your wife only produced weak children, the state could order another man, a proven warrior, to impregnate her. Adultery was mandatory if it improved the bloodline. And the Helots paid the highest price of all. They outnumbered the Spartans 20 to 1. Every year the Ephors declared formal war on them so that killing a Helot was never murder. The Krypteia was only the sharp end. Helot children were inspected too unofficially. Any that looked strong enough to lead a future revolt were quietly eliminated. By the 4th century BC, the system began to eat itself. The number of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, collapsed from 8,000 to under 1,000 in less than a century. Why? Because centuries of killing their own infants had shrunk the gene pool to a puddle. When Epaminondas of Thebes finally broke the Spartan army at Leuctra in 371 BC, there simply weren't enough perfect bodies left to hold the line. The bones speak in ways the Spartans never intended. In 2006, Greek archaeologists lowered cameras into the deepest part of the Kaiadas ravine. What they found wasn't a random scatter. The infant skeletons were layered like geological strata, century after century of systematic disposal. Some still had the tiny iron tags the state used to mark property of Sparta before the fall. One tag, still legible, reads simply, "Year of Efer Cleomenes. Rejected." But the most chilling discovery came in 2018. A separate pit, not the main ravine, contained the remains of adolescents and young adults. All male, all showing healed fractures followed by fatal skull trauma. These weren't battlefield dead. These were Spartan citizens who had passed the newborn inspection, only to fail later. The state had a quiet policy. If a boy reached 18 and still couldn't march 30 miles in full armor, or if he developed epilepsy, or simply grew too slowly, he vanished. Plutarch hints at it in one line. Those who became unfit were removed. The bones now prove removed meant a second trip to the same cliff, this time with hands bound. The system even had a name for these late failures. The Tremblers. Officially they were cowards who ran in battle. In reality, many were just disabled. Their punishment was social death first, then literal death. They were forced to wear red cloaks of shame, shaved on one side of the head, and barred from fire, food, or speech with citizens. Most starved or killed themselves. The ones who didn't were quietly marched to Taygetos at night. Spartan women weren't spared the ideology either. Girls who survived the newborn inspection were raised on the same starvation diet and forced into brutal foot races. The winners were paraded naked at festivals to advertise their breeding value. The losers simply stopped appearing. Aristotle writes that weak daughters were not reared. We now know where they went. The psychological toll on the survivors was catastrophic. Spartan men were famously laconic, short-spoken, because longer speech was seen as weakness. But private letters smuggled out on lead sheets show something else. Grown warriors writing to mothers they hadn't seen in decades, begging for any news of siblings who disappeared at birth. One letter, found in a temple cache, reads, "Mother, did you ever hold my sister before they took her? I dream of a cry I never heard." The mothers themselves were prisoners of the myth. The most revered Spartan women were the ones who produced the most sons, all of whom died young in battle. When a mother lost her last son, she was praised publicly and shattered privately. One grave stela from the 4th century BC shows a woman with 7 names carved beneath her feet, 7 sons, all dead before 30. The inscription ends, "She gave more to Sparta than Sparta gave to her." Even the famous Spartan equality was a lie built on corpses. The Spartiates called themselves the equals homoioi, but equality only applied to the survivors of the filter. By 371 BC, when Thebes crushed them at Leuctra, only 700 full Spartiates could still take the field. 700 perfect men, selected from tens of thousands of murdered children. The final irony: the system that made Sparta invincible also guaranteed its extinction. By the 3rd century BC, there weren't enough pure Spartans left to maintain the Agoge. They started recruiting Helots and foreigners, dressing them in red cloaks and pretending nothing had changed. Roman writers visited and laughed. The terrifying Spartans were now a tourist attraction, putting on mock battles for coins. Today, when you stand at the edge of the Kaiadas ravine, the wind still sounds like crying. Tour buses don't stop here. The official guides talk about Leonidas and Thermopylae. They don't mention the estimated 40,000, 60,000 infants and children whose bones fertilize the legend. The Greek government has quietly sealed the main excavation site. Too many tourists were leaving flowers. But the stones remember. Every perfect phalanx formation you see on a vase was paid for with a child thrown alive into that pit. Every time someone says this is Spartan Nahar with a smile, they're quoting a society that murdered its own future to look unbreakable for 200 years. The red cloaks weren't just uniforms. They were the color of the only childhood most Spartans ever knew. Blood on stone at dawn. And the worst part? They were proud of it. Plutarch ends his life of Lycurgus with a chilling line. Thus did Sparta achieve the most perfect obedience ever seen among men. He never mentions the price. The Ravine does. If this is the first time you've heard the real cost of the Spartan miracle, drop never again in the comments and share this with someone who still thinks discipline and toughness are the same thing. Because the cliff is still there. And it's still hungry.